transcript really quick. It's like no matter what I do, my hair just doesn't want to fall exactly right the way I want it to. Okay. All right, let's get the transcript going. Okay, we're gonna enable auto transcription. We'll go ahead and go. So I have a couple of announcements. So one of the first things, life is about handling sweet things and sour things. So I do have a little sour to follow up the sweet. The sour is basically that your next exam is coming a little bit sooner than you think. It is November 10th. Deep breath. It's going to cover intelligence. It's going to cover motivation and whatever I can finish from stress and health. And thankfully, stress and health is one of the shortest chapters in your book. So I will be giving a study guide out on Wednesday of next week, and our exam will be Wednesday the 10th. Now, because this is such a quick turnaround time, I am going to keep track of how we're doing in terms of coverage. If I have to push it back to Friday the 12th, I will. But I'll let you know that with at least a week to prepare. So I'm not suddenly going to be like you're all here on Wednesday the 10th, getting ready to take an exam. I'm like, let's do one more day. I'm not going to do that. So do kind of keep that in mind. So if you haven't really started reading chapter 8 yet, you probably should. If you haven't started reading chapter 9, we're going to start covering that today. So make sure that you get that in. And then we do have a quiz. We do have a quiz that will be due next Monday at 5 o'clock. Now, I saw that a lot of people didn't take the quiz that was due on Wednesday, and a few people forgot. I have reopened that for those of you that have not taken it yet. And I am giving you, there was a lot of people, like more than I'm comfortable with. So I reopened it for Friday at 11:55. So if you want an easy 10 points, it is available, okay? So I've reopened it for those who may not have had an opportunity to do that yet.
Sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
On the exam, did you move it up?
No, I'm not. I never move up. I will move back.
Yeah. Okay.
I never move up. That's horrifying. Why would it?
I could have sworn I just looked at my calendar.
No,
It looks like it's the 10th. So
yeah,
I
it is.
wasn't-
It is the 10th. I checked the syllabus before I came in today to make sure, because I always know that the way that I've set it up, that the time between the second exam and third exam is actually about 3 weeks. The difference is that most of the time between exams, it's 4 weeks. Because we don't always have a full 16 weeks. So because of that, the one between 2 and 3 is always a little shorter, but chapter 9 and chapter 10 should have slightly easier content, but chapter 9 is kind of long. So I want to try to start getting through that today. So we will see what happens. So we are not quite done talking about intelligence and IQ yet though, but we will finish today. So I mentioned the last time that when you look at something like the WACE, that you end up finding, because this is a normal distribution and because it is standardized, there are critical properties that a normal distribution tends to have. So the way that IQ scores and intelligence test scores are set up is that we basically compare your performance to a pre-tested group. The average of that pre-tested group is set at an IQ of 100. The standard deviation for this normal population or this normal distribution is 15. So you don't have to know this. You don't have to know the specifics of how this works. But because of the properties of the normal distribution, 68% of all scores will fall between an IQ range of 85 and 115. So they'll fall within one standard deviation of the mean. There's another about 95 to 96% that will fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So 95 to 96% of the population will fall between an IQ of 70 and 130. That leaves us with the remaining 4 to 5%, which are categorized in extremes. They're both out here in the tails. And we actually find that the remaining like 2 to 2.5% either have very high intelligence, which we are defining as an IQ of 130 or higher, because that's more than 2 standard deviations from the mean. And then we have intellectually disabled levels of intelligence. That is basically going to be 2 standard deviations or more below the mean. And then we do actually, once we get to about 3 standard deviations, that leaves about 0.1% on either side. So this is a very small percentage of the population. Most people are going to fall in that center bell portion right here. So this leads to a very interesting question. Is intelligence nature or is it nurture? And so is intelligence a product of something like genetics, or is it a product of your environment and your upbringing? And some people might be concerned, well, why should we care? Well, if nurture plays a role in your intellectual development, that means that you can modify it and you can actually do something about it. You can increase the intelligence of people around you if environment plays a role. I am so glad it's Friday. I hope you are too. The weather should be better than the past couple of days, though it will be kind of chilly. So for all of you that like fall and winter, you're going to really love this weekend. I'm just going to wish for summer to be back and bundle up. Everybody good? All right. So one of the things that we know, one of the ways, oh, did you need me to go back, Maddie? Okay. All right. So one of the things that we find when we look at twin studies is that there actually is a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. So what you're looking at here are different groups of twins. Now remember, as we talked about a while ago, identical twins or monozygotic twins share 100% of the exact same genes because they are derived from a single egg. On the other hand, fraternal twins who come from different eggs, they're dizygotic twins, they share 50% of the same genes, just as you would with any of your siblings. But what's kind of different about fraternal twins is that they're about the same age. So they tend to be treated similarly compared to siblings who are often different ages and thus could be treated differently. So when we look at these different correlations, you'll kind of see a little bit about how nature and nurture do interact. So notice that for identical twins that are in the same environment, their intelligence is very highly correlated. It's well over 0.8, which is pretty strong. But notice that if identical twins are reared apart, that correlation drops up to about a little over 0.7, indicating that while genetics does play a role, environment does have a very small contribution to make. Now, when we remove the genetic components, fraternal twins that are reared together, there's only about a 0.6 correlation between intelligence scores. So here we've removed the genetic component, but they have a very similar environment. Siblings that are reared together actually only have about a 0.45 or slightly higher correlation between their intelligence scores. So that kind of shows that environment again seems to play a role, because both fraternal twins and siblings share the same percentage of genes, 50%. But fraternal twins, because they are the same age, are more likely to be treated similarly than siblings of different ages. And we can see the strong genetic component. Unrelated individuals that are reared together, there's only a 0.3 correlation. So there is a very strong genetic component here, but the environment does have an impact. It's a small impact, but it is an impact nonetheless. Does anybody need some more time here? Okay. Well, somebody's having a good time. Okay. So we can also see the role that genetics plays with adoption studies. So we can look at children and their birth parents compared to their adopted parents. So here we have correlations in terms of verbal ability. And so here we have children and their birth parents. So we're looking at basically children who are not adopted. We have adopted children and their birth parents. And then we have adopted children and their adoptive parents. So here's what's kind of going on at 3 years of age. Notice that the highest correlation is between children and their birth parents. Notice that with adopted children, they don't really correlate very highly to either their birth parents or their adoptive parents. But by about the age of 16 years, as we're getting close to adult levels of cognitive processing, notice that all of a sudden, adopted children tend to look more like their birth parents in terms of their intelligence levels than their adoptive parents. So once again, this kind of shows that intelligence has a very strong genetic link. It's not a perfect link. It's not a perfect correlation. But it does mean that if you have parents that are above average intelligence, you might also have similar intelligence levels. Bless you. Everybody good here? Okay. So one of the things that I want to talk about, I just framed this in a potentially incorrect way. So when we talk about the role that genetics plays in intelligence, we don't often talk about the individual. That's not helpful. But one of the things that we find when we talk about genetic contributions to intelligence, there's an important concept called heritability. So right now, if I gave you all an IQ test, and I wouldn't actually do that because they're like 4 hours. But if I gave you all an IQ test, everybody would probably have a different score. We'd all vary to each other. We'd all vary. So one of the things that we find is that when we go out into the world and we look at our population, there's variability. Most people have different intelligence scores. So what explains the variability that we see in large groups of people? And this is what heritability is. It's not about your individual intelligence. It's about the fact that your intelligence scores might be different from somebody else's. And in general, we're going to see variability in large groups of people. So what explains that? So the variation, so heritability is basically this variation that we see that is due to genetics. And it's estimated that about 50% of the variability that we see across people in intelligence scores is due to genetics. So 50% of the variability that we see in people is due to genetics. But you know what that means? means that the 50%, other 50% has to be coming from somewhere else. So where's it coming from? It comes from a lot of different things. It comes from environment. It comes from socioeconomic status. It comes to whether or not you are a member of a privileged group. So there are a lot of other things that affect the variability that we see in intelligence test scores, but at least half of that is due to genetics. Everybody good? Anybody need some more time? Okay. So we have to talk a little bit about group differences. So I'm mostly going to talk about this in terms of racial or ethnic group as well as gender, because we do find pretty strong gender differences in intelligence based on different types of tasks. So why do groups differ in terms of intelligence, and how can we make sense of these differences? Now, one thing that we are not going to do, and I will not allow it, we do not use different to mean better or worse. And that's where I think a lot of people get led astray. And it's where a lot of intelligence researchers have been led astray. We find differences. Now, sometimes, in fact, most of the time, these differences between groups can be explained by things like access, wealth, privilege, etc. But sometimes we find differences that are harder to explain. And because of that, we often go, well, that must mean that this group's better than this group. No, we're not going to do that. I always get a little antsy when we talk about differences, because it's one very easy step to go, these groups are different, to this group's better than another group. So we are not going to do that here today. So here's what we know. So we're going to start by talking about racial and ethnic differences. We do know that for whatever reason, and I can think of a lot of different reasons why, but to talk about those would take far too long. And y'all, you're going to get me on another soapbox today anyway, so I'll try not to get on my soapbox too much here. But here's what we know. We know that racial groups do differ in their average intelligence scores. So we're not talking about an individual. We are talking about as a group. We also know that high-scoring people and high-scoring groups are more likely to attain high levels of education and high levels of income. And I don't know about you, but those high-scoring people tend to come from families that also have high levels of education and income. So odds are pretty good that at least some of this has to do with access and equitable access. And one of the things that I can tell you is that equitable access is often very hard to get if you are a member of an underprivileged and historically marginalized group, whatever that group may be. So for example, when I was in school, I actually went to a pretty upper middle class school, and it was also pretty white. We had SAT classes that you could actually enroll in and take as a class. I started every day of my senior year with SAT math because I needed it. But I would wager that schools that did not have that kind of access, schools that did not have that kind of money, would probably have a harder time instituting an SAT math class or an SAT prep class. And I can also tell you that the cost of these programs are very prohibitive. They're very prohibitive, and that can make it even more difficult. So here's what we know. Oh, you need me to go back? Okay. Oh, it's okay. I severely underestimate how long it takes people to write or type. Like, you're still going? I would have been done with that already. And I need to get out of my ego and get out of my mindset and be like, just because I can type and write fast doesn't mean that other people can. So I apologize if I have presumed too much.
No, you're fine. Okay, you're good.
Okay, thanks. So here's what we know. And this gap is shrinking. And I would also indicate that this has probably changed since about 1994. But we do know that in general, if we look at racial differences, we do find that white Americans typically will score higher in average intelligence than Black Americans do. And people who are Latina tend to be in the middle. I think the other term is Latinx, but if you speak Spanish, Latina actually flows better and fits with the language a little bit better than Latinx does. So I tend to prefer to use that, but everybody is different. Now, this is where we have to be careful. This gap has been pretty well reported. Again, this is an instance where this gap has been used to say that one group of people is superior to another group of people, and that it's always meant to be that way. And I would caution you against those things. So right around the time that this data came out, there was a very popular book by a writer named Charles Murray. Don't read him. I'm going to tell you off the bat, don't read him. That was called Bell Curve. And the bell curve is basically just, once again, kind of going to this eugenicist idea that some groups are naturally better than others. And here's data from IQ to show you that. The problem is, I don't know if y'all have seen an IQ test. We're going to talk about this a little bit. And this is where I disagree with your book. Your book kind of pivots and goes, we find these differences, but we're not going to say that these tests are probably culturally biased. Yes, they are. Like, I'm going to pivot away from your book. I disagree strongly with your book in that regard. We actually have other IQ tests that correlate highly that do not require things like being able to read or being able to write. And while those things are certainly important, you can be intelligent without being able to write. You could be intelligent and have intelligent thoughts without being able to read. So we'll talk about, I will show you an example of what is called a culture fair IQ test. Okay, so why would I argue that this difference is largely environmental? And your book actually argues this too. First of all, this gap is closing. I will mention this gap is closing, but here's what we know. We have similar genetics. We have similar genetics. Remember, these racial differences that we highlight are really nothing more than genetic variations in skin pigmentation. That's it. That is it. We have more in common with each other than we have more in common with each other than we are different from each other. You may actually have more genetics in common with somebody who is a different race than you than somebody who is of your own race under certain circumstances. So we have largely similar genetics. One of the other things that we find about this gap being environmental is schooling effects. Japan, for example, is considered a very intelligent culture. They generally tend to have higher IQs on the whole than, for example, here in the United States. And part of the reason is that they have a culture that is very intensely for education. They go to school on Saturday. They go to school in summer. How many of you would be okay with that? You're like, please don't take me to school on Saturday. Please don't take me to school in summer. Additionally, here's the best part. They have these big intensive national exams that determine what college you go to. That happens in a lot of other countries where college is free. I because college is free, you have to take these big national tests to figure out where you're allowed to go to. And in some cases, I've actually heard that your performance on those exams affects what you are allowed to study. Like, it's actually kind of amazing. But in addition to this, they want to do well on these national exams. They actually have in Japan something called a cram school. So after school, you go to this school to help you study better. So after school, you get more school. So schooling plays a huge role. It's part of the reason why we strongly push for things like universal pre-kindergarten, universal preschooling, because more education can really benefit the development of one's intellectual abilities. One other thing that we know is that there is something called the Flynn effect. Now, I will mention the Flynn effect is starting to change. I think the Flynn effect is pretty much done, but if I gave you an IQ test and I gave if your grandparents are alive and we kind of we had a time machine and we could return to where they were your age, if I gave you an IQ test and I gave it to you and I gave an IQ test to your grandparents that are basically your age, you would get a higher score than your grandparents. So the Flynn effect is basically the finding that from generation to generation, IQ, for whatever reason, was increasing. That has started to kind of level off. We're not sure why. I'm going to go ahead and blame Facebook, just because Facebook's a popular target to blame right now. I'm like, they're already doing so much wrong. Let's just throw one more thing on them. It's okay. So there is the Flynn effect. We know that everybody seems to, at least up to a point, be getting more intelligent from generation to generation. Additionally, and I think this is the most important part, there's no intellectual difference between racial groups when you look at them in infancy and early childhood. They look similar. So what is happening in the interim that is causing that gap? It's probably environment. It's probably issues related to access, issues related to equity, and issues related to privilege. So your book says all of this, and then they go, but no, IQ tests aren't culturally biased. The American Psychological Association takes a very similar stance. And to that, I say no. I can't agree with that. I can't agree with that. These intelligence tests have gotten their start from eugenicist aims, and though the tests have been modified over time, there is still some of that initial bias that lingers. Whoever is in charge of the test is going to put on that test what they believe the culture values. And that's usually going to be what the dominant culture values, the privileged culture values. And if you don't fit in with that, you're not going to do very well. So I don't agree that tests are culturally biased, or that tests aren't culturally biased. I think anytime that you are a person trying to create something, you're probably going to bring your biases in with you. And because of that, you need to be aware of them. Now, we do find that there is a difference in male and female performance as well. And once again, this is often used as evidence that maybe men are better at certain things than women are. And of course, I apologize, I am talking about this in a gender binary. We don't have enough data to kind of look at these things for people who might be non-binary or gender fluid or things like that. But historically, what we have found is that there are gender differences for people who present as male and people who present as female. In general, people who present as male tend to have better math aptitude. Now, here's what's critical. This is culture specific. Here in the United States, it is often kind of treated as a fact that women don't do as well in math as men do. Now, that's not necessarily the case. Now, it's changed. I think it has changed. But what's interesting is that when I was growing up in the 90s, there was a big kerfuffle over a talking Barbie doll. So it was a talking Barbie doll called Teen Talk Barbie. And one thing that she said was, math class is tough. And people got really upset about that because there is this idea that STEM is not necessarily for women. And again, this is starting to change. But in cultures where there are no gender differences that are assumed in mathematics performance, you don't see this gap in math performance. You don't. Men also tend to do better in mental rotation. It's one of the few times in cognitive psychology where I actually talk about a gender difference, but I would argue that some of that is also an environmental upbringing. When I was growing up, most of the boys that I knew played with things like Legos, or they played they played a lot of video games that encouraged them to consider spatial processing and mental rotating. And a lot of the girls that I knew really didn't. So it could be an environmental thing. And we do actually find that when you match different groups for things like video gaming experience, you don't really get this effect. Additionally, men tend to have greater variability in IQ. That means that generally, if we look at the bell curve of IQ and we go over to the section where we have very high intelligence, you're going to find more men. Likewise, if you go to the area where we have very low intelligence to the point of intellectual disabilities, you're going to find more men. They are much more variable in their intelligence. People that present as female tend to kind of concentrate more in the bell. They tend to be a little bit more centered. On the other hand, people that present as female tend to have better verbal performance. In general, we know that female presenting people often tend to have more words spoken to them in infancy, and that continues throughout life. They tend to do better at object location, and they are better at emotion detection. I would argue that's because they are often forced to. It's our job to nurture relationships. Okay, so let's have some arguments against this. There are natural differences between groups. I would actually argue that they're mostly environmental. This gap is closing fast, and research has actually found that if you actually highlight a stereotype, you can actually have those differences flipped on and off like a light switch just by reminding people of stereotypes or reminding them that they are a member of an underprivileged group. And this happens with women in math as well. If you have somebody circle their gender and identify their gender before a mathematics test, people who identify as female will often end up doing worse on that test than if you hadn't had them circle the gender option. Now, it's kind of hard to get that to replicate. That is one thing I will mention. I think this is interesting, but it doesn't, more research is coming out that maybe this doesn't replicate well. But we're talking about something called stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is basically the idea that you're worried about falling into a stereotype. So if you have to circle your gender on a math test, the idea is that it highlights the fact, oh, I'm female. There's a stereotype about women not being good at math. Uh-oh, I can't let anybody down. I don't want to fall into this stereotype. And I don't know about you, but when I'm anxious about something, I'm not going to give my test that test my best. So it kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, everybody good? Okay. So a stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that you will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So I'm going to use a goofy example. So, you know, I'm from Florida, right? And I'm sure you've heard all the stereotypes about Floridians. So how about you come up to me one time and you go, hey, you know, all those Floridians, they're not always very mentally well in the head. What about you? you know, and you just keep bugging me all day and I get worried about it. And then finally I snap and you go, aha, I knew it. You're Floridian. That's a really goofy example. Floridians are not oppressed, but we are tired of your Bugs Bunny jokes. We are tired. Well, I can't speak for other people, and I get it. Like, I wouldn't live in Florida either. It's too crowded and it's too expensive. But yes, we in Florida are tired of your Bugs Bunny jokes. Sawing off Florida and watching it float away. Right. Right, everybody good? Okay. So here's a famous example from a study by Claude Steele and Aronson back in 1995. So what they had to do was they looked at white and Black participants, and they were basically given SAT test questions. And basically, depending on the condition that you were in, you were told one of two things. You were either told that how you did on this test was indicative of your intelligence, or you were told, hey, we're just trying out these test questions for future versions of the SAT. So would you give these a try? We just want to test them out. So the idea was here that your performance was non-diagnostic of your ability here. Now, here's what's interesting. Generally, here we have the number of items correctly solved, and you can see that when you're not talking about your performance here being indicative of your intelligence, there are no differences between our Black participants and our white participants. However, if we say how you do on this is diagnostic of your intelligence, all of a sudden we see a gap. Now, I'm kind of curious as to what those error bars are. I don't know if they're confidence intervals or standard errors, and I know that many of you have no idea what I'm talking about, and that's okay. So I don't know if this is a significant difference or if it holds up on replication, but this does give us some evidence that if you're worried about being assumed something negative about you, that worry and that anxiety is going to end up hurting your performance as a result. So yeah, your book says that IQ tests aren't culturally biased, and I would disagree. I actually want to show you something really quick before we move on to motivation. So there are other people that have developed what are called culture fair tests. So the idea is that you don't necessarily need a lot of knowledge or even the ability to read or write to be able to do these tests. And they actually correlate really highly with IQ test scores. So I'll actually show you one that we gave in different laboratories that I worked in. What you're looking at here are what are called Raven's progressive matrices. So what you're looking at here is a puzzle. So here we have a puzzle, and basically what you are supposed to do, you need to fill in this missing piece with the piece that fits what's going on both across and down. So here, so we've got a circle here. It doesn't have a line through it here. Here it's horizontal. Here's one that's horizontal. Here's one that's vertical. Here's one that's empty. Here we have a plus that's empty. Here it's a horizontal line. So I'm hoping you're noticing that the correct answer is this one. So we call them progressive matrices because we start out really easy and then they get tougher as they go. What's actually kind of cool about this is that you can actually do this with 5-year-old kids on up. Now the 5-year-old kids don't get very much. At some point, that's going to be too hard for them. But you can do this with a wide variety of age groups, and you don't actually have to have knowledge of reading or writing, or even anything beyond basic math operations, like basic addition and subtraction. And these actually work pretty well. They kind of force you to think through the puzzle, and they correlate pretty highly with IQ scores. So this is actually pretty neat. I just wanted to let you know that this is something that exists. And if you like puzzles, you can actually find pictures of these online like I did and try them for yourself. Okay, with that in mind, here we go. We're going to talk about something I would suspect that many of you have very little of right now. We are talking about motivation and emotion. You're like, yes, Dr. Gilchrist, I have no motivation. What I find really interesting about the way that I structure the class and the way that I structure the book, we teach motivation when your motivation is probably at its lowest. And then after that, we teach stress when your stress is probably at its highest. I think it's funny, but I'm not laughing at you, I promise. Okay, so I want to start by talking a little bit about what motivation is. So how do you feel when you're motivated? What do you feel like when you're motivated to do something? What does it mean? So when you're motivated to do something, what sort of things do you feel? Yeah, Mariah. Okay, so you're excited, or you feel like you have a lot of energy to be able to do something. Now, how do you feel when you're unmotivated? When you don't have motivation, what's that like? Yeah, Staley. Lazy? You're tired, apathetic, you don't really care. How many of you are feeling pretty unmotivated right now? I'm sorry. Does the candy help? Maybe a little? Okay. So you seem to have a pretty good understanding of what it's like when you don't have motivation, you don't have energy. Motivation is basically a need or a desire that energizes your behavior and actually directs it towards some sort of goal. When you have motivation, goals are really easy to complete. So you have that energy, you have that direction, you know what you need to do, and you know how to meet that goal. Yeah, I know. Take a stretch. It's been a hard week. Okay. So here's a question I have for you. Why do you think people go to college? Please don't say to get more knowledge. And then don't talk about how people go to Jupiter to get more stupider. Yeah, Genevieve. Okay, so how many of you are in college because you want a good job? No shame in it. Okay. How many of you are going to college because you know that college graduates tend to make more money than people who don't? Yep. Now, are there other reasons that people might go to college? Yeah, Grace. I was like you. I was like you, where I really wanted to learn new things. And I knew that the job would probably come eventually. But yeah, I wanted to learn a lot of stuff. I also wanted to get out of my hometown. Anybody else? Yeah, Haley.
I know that for me personally, I don't want to end up like this.
Okay. So you have personal reasons. You want to try to break a generational issue of some kind. Yeah, I get that too.
I am the first one to actually go to college.
Me too. Me too. That's something I very much understand. I did not realize how important or special that was until I got to graduate school. And I realized that most of the people that I went to grad school with had parents that had college degrees. And I'm like, my parents both have high school diplomas. And what's been really cool is that now that and here's the thing is that doing that and achieving that can actually be a way to help them. Because once I started going to graduate school, my mom went back to school. She actually got her MBA, and it's like one of the first times where she actually makes more money than me, which is kind of amazing because that's never happened since I've been in grad school and beyond. My dad went back to college. My sister went back to college. She kind of had a rough go her first time, and she's working on her master's degree. Like, that sort of step can be a light to other people, and it's really cool when that happens. You can actually inspire other people with how you choose to live. But yeah, most people will say they're going to college for money or for more money in the future, for job or career training. I would hopefully argue that it's more than that. It is for learning some new skills, opening your mind, exposing yourself to ideas that maybe you don't necessarily get in your hometown or in your family. So it opens your world. And I think that's really cool. Now, college is not for everybody, but I think it can be a wonderful thing for those who want it. So we're going to talk about 3 different perspectives that we use to explain why motivation happens. So we're going to talk about drive reduction theory. We're going to talk about something called arousal theory. And then we're going to talk about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. How many of you have heard about Maslow's hierarchy? How many of you heard about it because somebody talked about it on TikTok pretty recently? Yeah, I have to look up. I actually haven't read any of Maslow's stuff, but I am kind of curious about some of the things, the recent criticisms that I've heard of his hierarchy of human needs. I am kind of curious, and I want to make sure I read more stuff and research more stuff before I, definitively say certain things. But I have heard he kind of not copied or stole, but he kind of built on some other work that had been done by other people, and maybe did not appropriately give them credit. Yeah, we don't do that. And by the way, in the syllabus, it says I'll be out of town next week. I'm not. I'm not. That conference I was supposed to go to was canceled. Well, it wasn't canceled. It's virtual now. And I don't want to go to a virtual conference. I'm tired. I'm an extrovert. I'm tired of virtual things. So I am not going. And so I will be here, which is good because we get more opportunities to learn about this next week. No, thanks for being here. I know the weather's been gross. I know it's been a rough week. I know your motivation, I know you're excited to learn this, even if your body language is like this. And that's okay. I just want you to be here in whatever way you want to show up as, and I'm happy that you're here. I'm always happy that you're here. Okay, one more slide and then we'll call it a day. All right. So drive reduction theory is basically the idea that we have physiological needs. We have a need for food. We have a need for water and beverages. We have a need to sleep. We have a need to use the bathroom. All of these are physiological states. And what we will find is that under certain circumstances, if we're not in balance, so if we're too tired, or we're too hungry, or we're too thirsty, or we're waiting to use the bathroom and we can't go yet, and we're squirming around waiting for the opportunity, that's going to create a state of tension or arousal. This is what is called a drive. And this is going to push you to basically satisfy that need. So the goal is to get you to what we call homeostasis, where we have this balanced, constant internal state. You're not too hungry and you're not too full like I was last night after dinner. You're not too thirsty, but you're not so full of water that you're like waterlogged. You're not too alert, but you're not too tired. So you're constantly going to be trying to always reduce those states of tension. So for example, if you are hungry, you are going to reach for some of the candy, which you can do right now because we are out of time. Help yourself to a little more candy, but bear in mind, I have one more class today that has not had candy yet. So take what you want. Please don't take too much and be mindful of other people, please. Have a wonderful weekend. Don't forget about your quiz. If you didn't take last week's quiz, I reopened it to tonight at 11:55. Please take it and have a wonderful day. Hi, what did I do?
Nothing.
Okay,
So Izzy's coming to see me.
okay.
But right now, there is only one biopsychology course, and it like runs from April to June the 5th.
Ooh.
There's an advanced one, but it's a 600 level in Indiana.
What
So
about the
that's
one that I recommended for St. Leo's that's physiological?
Well, that's what I'm here to ask you. Is
Okay.
that the same thing? Is physiological
Yes.
psychology the same
Yes,
thing?
it's about different parts of the brain and their functions.
Okay, so, well,
Mhm.
good. That was available from.
Yeah, no, bio, like,
January to February. so
yeah,
I'll-
that'll work.
I'll put it in that one.
Now, I will mention that it's higher level, so she needs to be prepared for that.
Okay. I'll tell her and you tell her too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 300 level course, but really our biopsych class should be a 300 level course too. And I still don't know. I mean, it's a holdover from the associate days, but it really should be a 300 level class.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yep.
Okay.
Hey, we need to make time with the meeting. Why didn't you, is
I'm
everything
sorry, I
okay?
emailed you
No,
saying that
No, I know that.